I'm sure many people will know this quote. So it's not what you have said or what you've done, it's how you make people feel. And that's what really sticks with people. So I'm sure everybody knows about the P&O situation, which was in the media, which actually was really quite shocking for us working in HR. I actually worked in the marine sector, so I just couldn't believe the way that they were actually approaching that situation. It was clearly a big change that they needed to make. They wouldn't have done it otherwise, but the way that they went about it had a real lasting effect on people. So what you do is really important. So we've said here, be led by your values. And I think in the charity sector, there's such high expectations for you. That's even more important because you're delivering a service to people, the beneficiaries, as Glenn was talking about. So you need to keep those in your mind when you're facing big change. It can be hard because you're starting to look at a process. You're thinking about the legal boxes that you need to tick off. So no matter what the change is, you need to spend time, put space in to think about, okay, how do we make sure that whatever the change is that we're implementing, that it fits with our values and that we do it in a way that is consistent with our values. So use them to guide your decisions, make space for them. And ultimately, it builds trust and credibility, and that will make everything easier. So if you're facing a difficult situation, you want to have trust and credibility, but also you've got the board and other stakeholders who'll be watching what you're actually going to do about the situation. We've got an example of something that can really make a big difference. And, you know, we go in, we see different situations and the way that they're handled. And I've seen one situation where a chief exec came in with a script, read out the script, and it was so scripted, very unnatural, and the employees just sat and were kind of in shock. And nobody asked any questions, and it felt really awkward. So partly, people need time to absorb the information, but also the way that it's delivered. If it's delivered in a human way with your own language, and you can build that trust, giving them as much information as you can do. There was one line manager sitting in the room who later spoke to me and said, I didn't even know that my own team were going to be affected until I was sitting there listening to the chief executive. So situations like that, have a think about how much information do you need to share and with who before you start communicating messages. That had a lasting effect for that person, and he actually applied for voluntary redundancy because for him the trust had gone, and so that was a bit of a negative impact for the organisation, who wasn't even, thinking that person would leave. So have a plan. It seems really simple. I love a plan. And I've put change without plan as chaos. It sounds very dramatic, but actually it is dramatic because what happens is it can create anxiety for people. If you don't have a plan and there's constant change, then people are watching from the outside saying, well, what's going on here? Do they know what they're doing? Why are we changing? Why don't they know the answers to the questions? So having a plan, you're not going to know everything at the start. You may need to change direction, but you do want to have certain aspects in place. So we've put timelines. Be realistic about that. Know what your timelines are. Depending on what the change is, there might be some legal timelines that apply, but actually, if it's something that's not following a legal process, you still want to have some form of realistic timelines that you're working to so that you can communicate that. Having a look at the key steps as well. So we've mentioned about the legal side as well. Being able to communicate that to people so they know what's going to happen next. Responsibilities as well, thinking about if there's managers involved, what will they have to do, and making sure that you're communicating that, giving them the space to ask questions about, okay, this is what I'm going to be expected to do. Can you give me support for that? Maybe you need some briefing sessions specifically for your managers and supervisors. Contingency planning, so I mentioned the plan may change as well. So what's plan B and C and D potentially? Mentioned about being realistic, and so what about risks as well? We've talked about employees upping and leaving, so that can always be a risk in a time of change as well. How are you going to cope? It's really important for charities to be able to continue the service to the beneficiaries, so you want to make sure that you've got some plan B, C, just in case these risk areas actually happen. Building in space to pause and reflect and change direction. I've mentioned that as well. So knowing your employment contracts is such a crucial one. We've had situations where being in meetings with clients and they're talking to employees about, okay, this is your situation, you being fixed term, and the employees say, well, actually, I'm a permanent employee. You need to know what you're actually dealing with before you start communications. So I've mentioned on here the different contract types, but notice periods as well. Length of service is another one. Is there a past date that's maybe not been brought forward and somebody's actually got a lot longer length of service than you actually know about? Compliance as well, avoid last minute questions and challenges. So making sure that you know what your responsibilities are there. We've mentioned about redundancy clauses as an example in there. So going through the contracts early on to say, okay, what do we need to do for any consultation coming up? I've mentioned redundancy, but this is for any change process that you need to go through as well. Mentioned collective agreements and union membership. Sometimes that can impact. It might not be an aspect for your charity, but check it out. Make sure you've covered that aspect. So communicating and consultation. So communication is massive, isn't it? It's just in everything that we do. It's so important to get right. We've mentioned that it needs to be clear, timely, and two-way as well. So there are legal requirements for certain processes. So that's something you need to make sure you know what your legal requirements are for your particular situation. But what I would say is don't fear consultation, because it can be a really positive process. It needs to be genuine, though, and actually the legal term talks about meaningful consultation. So people will be able to tell if there's more information that you're not giving them, or if there's a slightly different slant being put on the message. Be as open and transparent as you can be. Obviously, there will be some information that you might not be able to share at certain points. We've mentioned even if outcomes won't change. So we had a really interesting situation with People Know How, where at one point we had a group of reps and they held their hand up and said, okay, it's really looking like the writing's on the wall. So is it actually fair for us to keep going out to the employees and say, no decision has been made yet, give us any ideas you have, ways of avoiding redundancy, when actually we've only got about a week left. And it was a really interesting point that we had to cover, because yes, legally, the decision hadn't been made to make anyone redundant. But it was still a space to explore. There's certain aspects that just options were not available. So at that point, there was a communication went out and said, okay, these are the options that we've looked at. And I think that was a really good idea, because it meant that the employees knew, okay, all of these options have been looked at before. I don't need to look at them. They're already looking at those ideas. But there's still a point to consultation because questions will come up at any point, and there needs to be a safe space for people to ask them. So we've mentioned the legal requirement, but there is an ethical commitment to it as well, and it doesn't say that in the law, but that's something we wanted to share and just keep in your mind. Talked about timescales and providing space. Be visible as well, so don't shy away from consultation. It can feel really scary at first, but actually, if you're doing it the right way and you're justified in what you're putting forward and you've thought it through, you've planned it, then don't shy away from the consultation. You do need to answer the questions, and you might not have the answers when you're actually meeting with the employees or the representatives, and you don't have to answer in the moment, so then you can take them away and provide an answer later. So using the right language for your team, I mentioned before that's really important to make sure that it feels meaningful and genuine. So pulling this together, it's really about working with respect and dignity, thinking back to the values side of things. So make sure that you're showing empathy and listen actively. And I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here because you'll know that yourselves, but it's such an important point to remember. We've talked about the space as well. Give people time to process, and they'll do it at different timings and at different speeds. So that's something to remember. Some people will be on board with you straight away, and other people will take a little bit longer to let the information sink in. So we talk about psychological safety a lot these days, making sure that you protect the psychological safety of your team. We've talked about the support for your managers. So don't underestimate how hard they will feel if they're having to face questions as well. Make sure there's time to support everybody in the organisation. And just a reminder there so people remember how they're treated. So the key takeaways is making sure that you've got values-led decision-making and that planning is thoughtful as well, bringing in the human element. Know your obligations, get your legal advice early. Make sure that communication is genuine and treat people with dignity. And the end result there, you'll build trust, you'll reduce the risk, and you'll be leading in a human way, and you'll protect your legacy.